Yeah, thanks for having me here. I think it's obviously a very important issue that we're talking about, and I find it important to look at it from different perspectives. As it is the case usually with somebody who speaks on the very last day, you're in an awkward position of thinking, okay, some of the things have been said that I wanted to say. Some maybe I wanted to integrate, but I left that out. Specifically, the talk this morning by Mr. Schmidt has some similarities to what I'm doing now, but it will be a little bit different. Yeah, as the title suggests, and yeah, it's going to be kind of dense, but it's going to be 30 minutes straight, and I hope it's kind of clear. Here are the main ideas. Right? As the title suggests, my lecture will have two parts. In the first, analytically oriented part, I will present a very concise overview of the long intellectual history of the digital, concluding with the thesis that it is based on a deeply contradictory epistemology. In the second, more rhapsodic part, I will describe some of the phantasms that arise from this contradiction. I need some space. So first, the intellectual history of the digitalization. My initial thesis is that we can counter both the overwhelming effects of the current development of digital technology and the phantasms that arise from it, if we bear in mind that although the history of technology itself is young and its development rapid and unforeseeable, the theories on which this technology is based are old and well known. Max Horkheimer and, more recently, Gabriele Grammelsberger have already pointed out that René Descartes laid the theoretical historical foundation for technical thinking. In his Discours de la méthode of 1637, he proclaimed what is aptly called the analytical method. According to it, all problems should first be broken down into sub-problems in such a way that they can be answered with certainty, as Descartes puts it. And in the second step, the partial answers are to be put together again so that the complex connections emerge in their entirety. The accuracy of this new connection is guaranteed by the formal method of mathematics. It was so important to Descartes that it became the epitome, inbegriff, of rational thought for him. And he put it under the name of Mathesis Universalis. That means mathematics has an aletheological status. That means a theory of truth. Aletheological. This will remain exemplary. From here, we would have to move on to Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and describe his general theory of science known as Characteristica Universalis as a further development of Descartes' method, as well as Leibniz's invention of binary arithmetic, that means the conversion of all numbers to 0 and 1. Subsequently, one would end up with the decomposition of Hegel's project of absolute idealism, the boom of natural sciences in the 19th century, and logical empiricism that was fueled by it. George Edward Moore, Ernst Mach, Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, Ludwig Wittgenstein, and Rudolf Carnap, to name the most important ones, created a philosophy under this name, on the basis of which the technology we know today only emerged many decades later. To outline the basic characteristics of this epistemology, here, very briefly, they are: the radicalization of the analytical method into a strict reductionism, the resulting basalism as a definition of the simplest units, the algebraization of all thought, that means the development of a transcription procedure into an abstract formula language, the elaboration of logicism as the alleged basis of mathematics and any serious form of statement, a strict pyramidal relationship between the sentences in the sense of Russell's type theory, the concept of a unified science in which every statement, regardless of whether it describes physical or sociological or any other phenomena, is translated into the same technical language of algebraization and Basilism and so on. And finally, the rejection of all thinking that does not proceed in this way as metaphysics, as they call it. So secondly, after logical empiricism laid these foundations, the following additional theories were particularly decisive for the development of the digital, and I leave some out, but these are the most important ones, and I will not go through all of them. You know them. I will just point out one thing, and that is Claude Shannon's information theory that adopted Carnap's definition of data, which Carnap understood as the triple of space, time, and measurement. Information, in turn, is defined as the sum of such data. That's important. What all these theories have in common is that they are mathematical models, make universal claims, and are directly linked to logical empiricism, but they radicalize it. This is because the smallest descriptive unit of the empirical is no longer sentences, which have a meaning, but data, which as such are completely meaningless. And their linking is no longer produced by formal logic alone, but by the most complicated mathematics, by algorithms and so on, and can no longer be managed by humans, but only by calculating machines. So, the logical empiricism is radicalized to algorithmic procedures executed by machines on the basis of data pools. That's the most important idea. In terms of the history of theory, however, it is crucial that logical empiricism has already failed, as Willard van Orman Quine's work has shown. So we have a development further, but actually, if you look at the history, logical empiricism has failed. In addition to Wittgenstein's and Carnap's failure to define a basic unit and other problems that I won't mention, which made Basilism obsolete, Quine's essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism in particular, contrary to his own intention, brought down both epistemological pillars of logical empiricism. Firstly, he showed that the concept of analyticity cannot be maintained with the means provided by this doctrine. That means that analytical judgments in the Kantian sense, which are indispensable for logic, cannot be justified within this doctrine. And secondly, with his theory of empirical underdetermination, he has severed the direct link between language and the world. So logic and empiricism lose their truth-guaranteeing aletheological status in his epistemological holism. Instead, Quine, like Carnap before him, and later also the theory of artificial intelligence, moves to a theory of probabilistic approach to truth in which there is actually no true or false anymore, but only different degrees of congruence. At this point, the most fundamental epistemological and aletheological problem of logical empiricism and all subsequent theories becomes visible, and that's kind of the core of my talk now. The assumption that an immense pool of basic propositions or data would have a correspondence with the external world, even if probabilistically tamed in its claim, remains within the mold of the correspondence theory of truth. It assumes the isomorphism of linguistic and worldly structures. In other words, and semiologically speaking, this assumption is based on a concept of the sign that has only two poles. In contrast, Peirce already insisted in the 19th century that signs, in addition to the object reference and their own sign corpus, must have an interpretant as a third component in the sense of a sign effect. There's no sign without its use in a subsequent sign that appears in the individual thought process or, even more often, in the social practice of communication. That's the third pole. While the relationship between the world and aggregated data on which the digital is based simply postulates a relative correspondence that is a dyadic relationship between them, we can only speak of meaning at all at the moment when this relationship is actually thought, that is, when it becomes triadic, not dyadic. Meaning as a processual, inconclusive social practice of symbolization or interpretation always requires the third, which can also be described as the medial of media philosophy. From this, it follows that epistemology cannot exist without the categories of meaning, psychology, communication, the social, the economic, and the political, categories that were radically excluded from logical empiricism. And, by the way, they tend to be excluded in discussions today too. And another remark, from this it becomes visible that the subject of logical empiricism was without a body, a biography, a social position, and so on. So actually, it was a human modeled after a calculating or cogitating machine. That's where we came from, and that's what I want to counter. Quine's before-mentioned transition to probabilism may give the impression of intellectual modesty, but because now we know of its semiological deficits, it actually means that we are dealing with a failed theory that has nevertheless become the basis of many of our worldviews. The question would be now how this came about. One theory that has attempted to answer this question and describe the main features of contemporary epistemology is Jean-François Lyotard's theory of postmodernism. His decisive idea is not, as is commonly assumed, that postmodernism liberates us from the impositions of an over-compact rationality that determines the grand narratives of modernity. The empirically existing postmodernity can only at first glance be understood as a plurality of small narratives with equal rights, as he puts it. In fact, one of the narratives, a specific language game, namely the technological one, achieves dominance and reshapes all the others. For Lyotard, this means, firstly, that all knowledge is subject to the principles of segmentability, calculability, recombinability, and electronic transportability. Secondly, this particular language game achieves universal validity. In other words, the actually existing neoliberalism, armed with information technology, can only be described by the dialectical figure of a grand little narrative. And thirdly, the eletheological and political foundation function for knowledge, which in the modern era consisted of an orientation towards truth and justice, in the postmodern era shifts to a new general criterion, namely performativity in the sense of efficiency. And this kind of connects very directly to what we're talking about today. I will maybe come back to that later, but the question, for example, also behind the AI discussion is what are the basis in science sociology, what are the political impulses, what are the problems in international economic war, let's say. Josef Vogel, among others, has recently attempted to build on Lyotard's thesis and grasp the current state of the connection between capitalism, technology, epistemology, and ideology. The logic of the small grand narrative becomes the basis for ultra-frequency trading on the financial markets on the one hand, and the platform economy of the anti-social media on the other. For both, not only is everything that cannot be quantified excluded, but events are also separated from causes, and thus causality is replaced by correlation. This statistical agnosticism leads to an end of theory, as Vogel calls it, that means to the de facto abandonment of epistemology as such. And we've heard the natural science version of it this morning. So what Lyotard describes for ideology, Vogel shows for economy and the irrationality of platform communication. To sum up the first part, the theses are, firstly, that there is an intellectual prehistory of the digital. Secondly, that these theories have failed argumentatively and that we are actually dealing with epistemological zombies. Thirdly, that the reasons that they are still being adhered to are economic and political expediency. Fourthly, that they represent an epistemology that is simultaneously based on dogmatism and relativism at the same time, instead of critical amelioration, that is the attempt of gradual improvement of knowledge as Peirce described it. And finally, that the digital cannot be adequately conceived if the semiological, theoretical, historical, mental, historical, economic, and political aspects are not taken into account. The fact that these connections are not understood leads to the establishment of phantasms. And don't worry, I won't go through all of them, but just the most important ones. When talking about miniaturization and gigantization, I mean, the breaking down into data and smallest parts, and then reprocessing it with huge server power. This is what we've heard this morning, today also. However, I'm with the third phantasm now. However, despite the immense effort involved in miniaturization and gigantization, that is in analysis and synthesis in the Cartesian sense, we are dealing with a systematic misinterpretation of phenomena. This already implies to the digital single image, for example, the microscopic rasterization and recomposition actually already prohibit the talk of images at the pre-reflective phenomenal level, because it is actually a geometrically ordered collection of dots. And on a higher perceptual and aesthetic level, all categories such as figuration or perception of form, foreground, middle ground, and background, realism or montage are just gone. Same goes for entire films, for example. So what they're actually doing is it's a huge movement of irrationalization and the hiding of it. The pragmatic phantasm kind of is the fascination for the functioning of these whole processes on a large scale still, but what's more interesting is the fifth phantasm here. In addition to the fourth, as a mirror image of the previous one, there is the exculpatory phantasm. It implies that all technical problems existing in the presence, such as when ChatGPT declares an innocent person to be a multiple child murderer, are answered with the promise of future expansion of the database and refinement of the codes. But this is based on misleading formulations. Strictly speaking, technology does not make mistakes. It delivers the necessary results from the data and algorithms. The actual error is not a technical one, but an ideological one, and consists in the fact that we assume that reality reduced to informational units and thought reduced to algorithms correspond to the world, and then we shift all the discrepancies to the realm of the provisional. The probabilistic justification for this consists in a seemingly rational and modest assumption that one approaches an adequate description as best as one can with epistemologically approved means. But because this procedure is based on a dyadic concept of science, it is in reality conceptually incapable of reconstructing thought and its relationship to the world at all. Probabilism, as it appears analogously in the history of science, in logical empiricism, in the development of artificial intelligence, and in psychological test theory, to solve foundational problems, suggests an openness that only concerns its quantitative increase. The mode of thinking itself, however, does not escape its self-imposed rigidity. Already Heidegger has emphasized this point. The fixation on the technological makes all corrections themselves appear only as technological. And by making everything non-technological conceptually unreconstructable and empty from a technological perspective, it obstructs its own access to critique. In other words, that which could call generalized quantification into question can itself not be quantified. Therefore, the insistence on probabilistic approximation and provisionality is merely argumentative self-immunization against the obvious pointer to inadequacy. I go to the seventh. As various technicians confess, and we've heard it before, not even they understand how algorithms work or IA2 in detail. In fact, we are dealing with a black box which suggests that we should abandon attempts at comprehensive explanations and commit ourselves to a pragmatic mode in two ways. Firstly, Edfin has worked out in What Algorithms Want that although algorithms are considered unambiguous, regular, and rational, they are in fact largely secretive, messy, and inscrutable, and he states, where little or nothing can be understood, all that remains is pragmatic surrender. It just works. And secondly, if it remains inexplicable what the technology does, the only option is to measure its benefits inductively by its effects. This inductive method, which is itself a procedure of epistemology, may be approved in other areas of research, but in the field of the digital technology, scale and expertise are often in an anti-proportional relationship. Psychedelics, for example, or strong drugs may only be administered with the approval of doctors. Professional expertise decides whether the risk they pose to patients justifies the expected benefit. But the algorithms behind anti-social media, for example, are at best half understood, and yet the intended addictive mechanisms are applied to a whole society that thus becomes the guinea pig of its own suppression. However, the idea that some kind of technological education protects us from succumbing to techno-capitalist heteronomy is also dangerous, and I'm at the 8th point now. Adorno already stated for the culture industry that the idea of being able to see through its mechanisms of standardization is an essential part of it. The problem becomes even more acute when everyday activities are so closely intertwined with technology, as is the case today. Bernd Bösel, among others, has pointed out that the psychotechnological arsenal of reactualized behaviorism and affect control starts decisively at the pre-rational level. The unconcealed intention to evoke reactions in the anti-social media appeals to impulsivity, not reflexive capacities. However, this weakens an ability that is fundamental to the functioning of democracies, namely the ability to detach oneself from one's own immediate needs, to see not only one's own interests and thus of the own reference group, but also to keep the good of the whole in mind and to be prepared to show solidarity to a certain extent. Conversely, such pre-rational manipulation is accompanied by rationalization processes in a psychoanalytic sense. The subjects very well perceive their loss of autonomy due to their seemingly unavoidable entanglement in the digital infrastructure, and they conceal this by pseudo-explanations taken from self-help books or provided by the culture industry itself in order to mitigate the narcissistic injury. Terms such as procrastination or binge-watching make phenomena that are supposed to appear unchangeable, socially acceptable, and thus serve to affirm heteronomy. Ninth, empirical observation of debates on new uses of the digital, including those explicitly concerned with the well-being of people, shows that the phantasms mentioned so far are associated with a naturalization of technical developments. In a discussion organized by the Vivantes Hospital Group, for example, the inevitability of these technical developments was first asserted, and then apps were praised as surrogates for psychiatric and psychological treatment. The argumentative shell game, Hütchenspiel, swaps the undeniable technical improvement with the question of the connection between means and ends, thereby immunizing itself argumentatively. In this way, doubts about the usefulness of the use of technology in certain areas are distorted into technophobia. At the same time, such naturalization makes it possible to conceal economic interests, both with regard to maximizing private sector profits and with regard to the artificially created pressure to save money in public institutions. The fetishization of technology as a seemingly autonomous and not man-made means legitimizes the self-abandonment of politics as an instance of collective control and falls back into what Marx already described and criticized as productive forces optimism. I would argue that the actual political phantasm, though, associated with the digital has a different status. For it is reasonable to assume that the lofty ideas about solving or alleviating social, economic, and ecological problems associated with the digital represent the surrogate of political utopianism. However, since any kind of democratic socialism was declared obsolete after 1989, and since then any more ambitious attempts to counter the neoliberal consensus have been prevented, in a world of multiple crises, there seem to be only two ways out to alleviate the undeniable impositions: neo-fascism and digital utopia. The power struggle at OpenAI between effective accelerationism and effective solutionism has provisionally ended in favor of the former. This accelerationism, which ventilates the overcoming of an allegedly pitiable present towards the future of a claimed new humanity, should be countered with Brecht's historical philosophical insight that those who make the future outcome of the process absolute fail to recognize the irreversible gravity of the present and thus negate the victims of the same process. But the implementation of solutionism, on the other hand, would not offer a suitable alternative either. Solutionism would also be a technocratic reductionism, a post-political replacement of the public and democratic balance between the interests of groups. The unambiguity in decision-making provided by solutionism and longed for by parts of society is precisely the opposite of the multi-perspective and also agonal discursivity of the political. Viewed from a critical distance, the political phantasm associated with the digital appeared to be an ideological effect of a blockade that has arisen through the voluntary self-abandonment of politics with the help of debt breaks and other neoliberal means. Because of its empirical ineffectiveness, politics is to be replaced by technocracy. But the processing of the problems in need of social regulation along functional imperatives corresponds to a fundamentally different mode than that of deliberation. deliberation. So, solutionism can never become socialism. This should not be the last sentence, but I stop here, and it's kind of a nice sentence.